Hi, and congratulations on completing week 6. Be holy, for I am holy. We had 4 goals this week: to evaluate the purpose and content of ritual and offerings, to interpret the theological role of offerings in the context of the New Testament, to evaluate the meaning of holiness and the concept of holiness as a major theme in Leviticus, and then finally to apply the meaning of holiness in a ministry setting. We had a couple of assignments. Assignment 6.1 was a ritual chart, and based upon your reading in Leviticus 1 through 7 and Alexander, you were to complete a chart where you outline 5 types of offerings, and for each type of offering, specify the ritual components and purpose, and then discuss why these are no longer required for Christians. Be sure to include a conclusion, pulling your findings together. So the grading of this was pretty simple and straightforward. Did you identify the 5 types? Did you give detail, extreme detail as to what is included, or did you just kind of gloss over and said an animal or parts of an animal were offered and so forth? And then how was your discussion? Now, it was important to note that the grain offering is actually tied to the tithe and therefore is required of Christians today, while the others are for atonement of sin and therefore are tied to the atonement of Christ. So wanted to see a distinction between grain and the others. Wanted to see some detail as far as biblical support where they're discussed, and an understanding that the ritual system was a way to obtain holiness and atonement in order to be in God's presence, while Christ gives that to all believers. So it's not an ongoing process in Christ. It is a one and done kind of event. You might have, in your conclusion, talked about sanctification versus holiness. Might have talked about different levels of holiness and how the priesthood was at a higher degree of holiness, or the camp was at a higher degree of holiness or a lower degree of holiness than the temple. So there were lots of other aspects you might have discussed for an A+ paper, but the primary purposes were: did you include reading, outside research, or engage in reading and engage with outside research, in addition to fully giving a detail of what each of these offerings included. And the reason I wanted to see detail was it shows you how cumbersome and how difficult this process was for holiness in the Old Testament. Our discussion post in Leviticus 19:2, God states that the Israelites, "Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy." And I wanted you to create a 1-page post discussion of what you believe God means by this statement. I wanted to see an in-depth word study through Logos or other methods to be able to truly understand what holiness and to be holy means. So what does it mean to be holy? How does one become and stay holy? And really the discussion here, and some folks I felt like went off task. In Christ, we are holy. And even though we sin, we are still holy because of that atoning sacrifice of Christ on the cross. However, behavior is different in a Christian New Testament setting than the stative of being holy. And some folks kind of worked over towards justification by works by saying that we need to behave in order to be holy, and that kind of works against the whole atonement of Christ. And that's one of the reasons why we do this assignment, is to identify those little glitches that in fact can lead to a heretical position. So our whole holiness is through the atoning work of Christ, not through any work of our own, and it supplants or negates the need for the sacrificial system. Then I wanted you to talk about implications for living a holy life in our modern context. We are still holy through Christ, but there are things as far as sanctification where we can grow in Christ and grow in our Christian maturity. So I think folks did a pretty good job. I still would like to see a little more discussion, but I think we're on the right track and on a whole doing okay. He identified points. For the definition, it would be nice to include a Hebrew word study to understand the meaning and use. Everyone is supposed to have Logos, so being able to use Logos is great. Here is one outside that people could have used, the Blue Letter Bible site, and which has calculated that the term holy is used 611 times in the King James Version, 70 times in Leviticus as a noun, 29 times in Leviticus as a verb, and 15 times as an adjective. Now that tells us that this term has lots of different ways it can be used, because clearly a verb and a noun and an adjective are very different uses, and to be able to split them out is helpful in our understanding. And then the student goes on, when it is a noun, it is said to be used as, among other terms, apartness, sacredness, separateness. When it is a verb, to consecrate, sanctify, prepare, dedicate, be hallowed, be holy, be sanctified, be separate. And when it is an adjective, it is used as sacred, holy, holy one, and set apart. Alexander states that the world of ancient Israel, the priests are considered to be holy, the Israelites clean, and non-Israelites unclean. But the consensus of the works research states that to be holy means to be set apart or separate, and therefore the Israelite nation, as God's people, was a holy nation. Need to ponder how holiness is tied to sanctification. Hartley notes that the verb be or become in Hebrew captures the maturing dimension of holiness on a human plane. This implies that sanctification is a process by which Israel makes herself holy by separating herself from sin and all that defiles. A few of the other important points where it's important to recognize that only God can make holy, and holiness is needed to be with God, usually associated with God's transcendence. Some did not address the idea of being holy in the Old Testament and rather jumped a little quickly to talk about Christ, and I wanted us to spend some time in the Old Testament first. Holiness, righteousness, and sanctification reflected in a few comments this week. There is a vast difference between being holy and doing holy actions. To be holy is much more reflective of the heart, the will, the attitude, the God-inspired motivation that any individual or set of set of actions. I would even go one step further, is to say that because holiness is a gift from God and because of the atonement of Christ, that our position as holiness stands under the blood of Christ. A deeper question raised by a few people. As a believer, yet a sinner saved by grace, am I really sacred or set apart as I still sin? Some struggled with this post because it seems almost contradictory that I am sanctified by virtue of the fact that I am saved by grace. And yet it is through grace, through Christ's atonement, that in fact we are sacred and set apart. So, email or call me with any questions this week. As I mentioned in the last verse, I'm doing some field missions work this week and next week. So it may take me a minute to get back with you, but I will have email and internet access most of the time, unless I'm flying, in which case I will land first before I get back to you. So have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.